All right, now we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. This is about the cultural differences between Germans and Americans, particularly the differences we find in the corporate world. As we shall see, this will be a great opportunity to discover a lot of vocabulary words we see in the area of HR or human resources. Things like employee benefits and vacation days. Now, from the first look, the differences between these two cultures is not that vast, relatively speaking. I mean, both are Western cultures that have embraced capitalism and have a strong consumerist culture. At first glance, the major differences seem architectural, with German cities having nice historic city centers, but lacking the skyscrapers we see in most large American cities. But as anyone knows who has spent time abroad, sometimes the subtleties or finer details in everyday life, well, these can be quite different. They can also be harder to notice right away. And before I talk about these differences, I just want to make a quick qualification. Obviously, we don't want to overgeneralize. Of course, not all Germans are one way, just as not all Americans act one certain way. There are all kinds of personalities within every culture. While this is important to remember, I think we can agree that certain cultures have distinguishable qualities. Please don't imagine that I think the American way of life is better. In fact, as you shall see, I'm often quite critical of the US. I don't want to say one way is better than the other, but simply there are two different ways, both with their advantages and disadvantages. So, without further ado, let's get started. One of the first major cultural differences easy to notice between Germans and Americans is that the latter are typically far less direct. In other words, Americans are typically more indirect and therefore polite in their communication. Whereas Americans like to build rapport or to create a friendly and trusting relationship, Germans often get straight to the point without too much small talk. Personally, I like the German way. Even though I'm an American and I'm used to building rapport first in conversation, I actually like getting straight to the point when I make a phone call. I actually have a couple funny examples. My wife is German, and after we moved to Germany, I began to experience this German directness for myself. One time, her father was over at our house, and she asked him his opinion about a photo she had taken. Now, as an American, I'm taught the value of a so-called white lie. In other words, we think it's better to not tell the truth if it might unnecessarily hurt the other person. But my German father-in-law had no such upbringing. He shook his head, scowled, and said, "No, I don't like it. It's too kitschig." What's interesting is how uncomfortable I felt. My stomach felt twisted and I felt sick because this directness went against all my social training. Of course, over the years, I've become more direct myself, and I notice this when I'm back in America and people seem a bit shocked by my direct questions. Another short example of this indirectness is the use of softeners that English speakers like to use. This is actually quite important for business as well. Typically, when we have to deliver what might be considered bad news, we have to warn someone with a simple word or phrase like, "I'm sorry," or "unfortunately not." For example, for me as a teacher, even if a student answers wrong, it's difficult for me to simply say, "No, you're wrong." Instead, I need to say, "Unfortunately, I'm afraid that's not quite right." That's what we mean when we say Americans are indirect. By the way, the British are too, probably even more than the Americans. Another huge difference in corporate culture are the country's approaches to hierarchy. Germans tend to be more hierarchical. Decisions are typically made by senior management, and there's a clear distinction between different organizational levels. Germans place a huge emphasis on degrees and certifications, and managers and leaders often have PhDs. In fact, the German hierarchy can be very rigid, and no promotion will be considered if the employee doesn't have the appropriate certifications or degrees. As an American, this drives me crazy because instead of prioritizing actual real-world job experience, the Germans place more value on the university degree, which may or may not reflect an ability to actually get the job done. In America, as long as you perform well in the job, as long as you show skill, it doesn't matter what degree you have, or for that matter, if you have any degree at all. If you're good at your job, you can move up quickly in a company. This isn't really the German way, which is, as I said, more strictly hierarchical. However, I can say that this traditional rigid attitude is beginning to change. There's less emphasis now placed on degrees, but degrees are still very important. But still, the atmosphere in a German office is more restrained and formal than in America. I don't know how it is in your language, but I think a lot of European languages have two ways to address someone, in a formal and in an informal way. In fact, most European languages have two words for you, which obviously are both you in English. I don't want to confuse you, so concretely speaking, the Germans say Sie in formal situations and Du in relaxed conversations with their peers or friends. Both words translate to you in English. In French, it's vous in formal situations and tu among friends. In more traditional German offices, employees must use the Sie form when speaking with their superiors or managers. Thus, the language itself creates a distance between the employee and the manager. In comparison, Americans are much more familiar or friendly and even joke with their superiors, and are usually on a first-name basis with them. Another striking difference in working culture has to do with innovation and flexibility. Now, if you start to think I'm painting the Germans in a negative light, just bear with me till the end. In general, however, managers and decision makers in America have a much easier time to install and implement their new measures. In general, Americans are willing to take greater risks, thinking that if a problem arises, they can deal with it later. In contrast, decision-making in German companies tends to be thorough or really thought out, with a focus on minimizing risks. Obviously, I might be overgeneralizing, but this difference is also illustrated by consumer behavior in general. In particular, in car buying behavior. As we all know, a car is often a big purchase, and as a result, we often have a need to finance it. Sure, in America, we bought our first cars at 16 and 17 years old, and they were often cheap, sometimes around $1,000 or $2,000. But honestly, I hardly knew anyone who didn't finance their car. In other words, we didn't have the money up front, but paid it monthly. This was simply how things were done. But in Germany, I've met so many people who first saved up the money, sometimes to sums of up to 10,000 euros or more, and then bought the car with one lump sum payment. This is practically unthinkable in many households in America, but illustrates nicely the more conservative fiscal approach of the German. But I don't want to get too far off track, because there's an explanation for the increased flexibility and innovation of the American manager. This is another difference that I found shocking at first, and that is the concept of a works council. A works council, by the way, is the British translation of the German Betriebsrat. There's no American translation because they don't exist in America. And as we shall see, while this works council is great to ensure and protect employees' rights, from the American perspective, it can greatly slow innovation and change. Because if a manager wants to make a change, often even a small change, it must first be approved by the Works Council. The Works Council play a significant role in company decision-making, especially decisions about workplace conditions and employment terms. In America, the HR department performs some of these functions of this German Betriebsrat, but not nearly to the extent or level. If a German company plans a merger or an acquisition, that is, if they want to buy another company or merge with an existing one, they must first consult with the Works Council. Also, if a company wants to lay off a lot of employees during a company restructure, they must negotiate with the Works Council. The Works Council can even delay the process. That's how much power they have. By the way, layoff is the American term for what British call to make someone redundant. A layoff is when a company lets go of an employee because the company needs to save money or there is not enough work. This is different than when a company fires an employee. When an employee is fired, this usually means they did something wrong or even illegal. But an employee can still be laid off or made redundant, even if they do a great job. When I explain to my German colleagues about the right to hire states in America, they look at me with wide eyes. Because in some states in America, the employer has every legal right to fire you from one day to the next. In other words, the employer doesn't need to give a reason and doesn't need to warn you in advance. Unlike in Germany, where the employer is sometimes required to give you a year's notice that you will be laid off. In America, you can come to work one day and be fired the next without any reason. Luckily, this doesn't really happen that often, but legally speaking, the employer could do it. In any case, I would say the average American worker does not feel that secure in their job. They have little job security, which is a nice segue or transition into the final corporate cultural difference I'd like to discuss today. And that has to do with work-life balance. One of the things I love to ask my American friends is how much vacation time they imagine a German employee gets from day one. They usually guess around 20 vacation days. When I tell them that the typical German employee with a permanent contract usually has 30 guaranteed vacation days, they can't believe it. You see, Americans have on average 14 vacation days, but only after working at a company for 5 years. After 20 years, if they stay at the company that long, they would first have 20 vacation days, which is obviously still far from what the German receives on day one. Another major difference is that Americans don't take those 14 days off at one time. It is actually unthinkable to take so much time at once. Americans don't want that their colleagues have to pick up the slack or do their work for them while they're gone. Germans, on the other hand, love to travel and often take 2 weeks off or more at once. They don't mind picking up the slack for their colleagues because they know that soon enough, it will be their turn for vacation. And since we're talking about employee benefits, I should discuss parental leave. This is the time off you get when you or your wife has a baby. What do you think? How much paid parental leave do you think American workers are guaranteed? If you guessed none, then congratulations, you're right. The US doesn't have a national paid parental leave policy. There are some exceptions to this, but in general, these exceptions don't guarantee pay, but only time off. And the expectation is that the mother quickly get back to work. In America, this idea that a father also takes time off after a birth is not as widely practiced like it is in Germany. Now, how much paid parental leave do you think Germans are guaranteed? How about 3 years? That's right. During parental leave, parents can receive parental allowance to compensate or make up for lost income. Basically, this parental allowance is paid for up to 12 months, and the amount of money depends on the income or salary level. They also have a lot of flexibility as to when they can take the parental leave. In other words, they can wait until the child is 3 years old before taking time off. In fact, they can wait as long as until the child is 8 years old. Parental leave is different than maternity leave, which is just for mothers. In Germany, mothers are guaranteed full pay 6 weeks before the birth and 8 weeks after. That's 14 weeks fully paid, and they have full protection of their jobs. By law, employers must ensure or guarantee that the job is still available when the mother comes back to work. In America, paid maternity leave is greatly different between each state, but almost all states do not offer fully paid leave, and most are rather short. The exceptions are tech companies like Google and Facebook, which offer the most generous paid maternity leave plans in the country. Here, a mother can receive up to 22 weeks of paid leave. Okay, I'm going to cut it off here before I go even longer. There's still so much we could talk about, but I think we have enough knowledge now to see why, tomorrow, these cultural differences might explain why the great American discount retailer Walmart failed in Germany.